States is the best way to do it.
So, what is the balance for you as you enact some of these things that you're talking about on a societal level, changing state policies and all of those kind of things? Because I agree,
Yeah.
to enact any sort of change on that level, I do think that's one of the problems with this top-down approach in anything, whether that's a progressive policy or whether that's a conservative policy, whether it's a Christian policy or non-Christian policy, it's a secular policy. All of these things is harder to manage from a top down level because everyone then becomes subject to it, and not everyone has
Yeah.
the infrastructure, not every state has the funding, not every state has the ability to make these things happen. And so, what's
Like,
the balance for you? As you're advocating for this, talking about this, all of this stuff, what's the balance between um, policy and government reform, because that's really kind of the wider
mm,
space of what we're talking through, and the
yeah.
responsibility and the role of pastors and churches and Christians. In other words, how does the evangelism and the discipleship processes, and I know you said that you see those things as intricate. I would agree that you have to evangelize and
Intricately
disciple.
connected. If you remove one from another, they kind of become useless, you
Yeah, I
know.
mean, the Great Commission has two action items coming out of it, right? Go
100%.
and
Yeah,
disciple, right? And
exactly.
so, what's the balance between kind of the practical, what we know to be the Great Commission and what we know to do as Christians, versus the activism and policy reform and really government changes that we see kind of on that macro level, statewide,
Yeah.
and then getting to a national standpoint.
Yeah, because evangelism and discipleship is the micro change. Like it's the micro level of change. Whereas I would say that that society and full societal change is the macro level of that same thing, right? And so where I kind of draw some lines and where I kind of like would make the difference is that regardless of the nation that we live in, evangelism is a primary that can't escape because my primary and honestly at a level sole identity is Christian. So those are responsibilities that I can never escape. But then there's additional responsibility that comes into play whenever I live in a society like America where it's a democratic republic and I should vote. And I should campaign for and I should believe for whatever I believe. Because the purpose of voting is just saying, hey, I should have a voice and I should be able to contribute to whatever I believe is the greatest good for my nation. And I think any Christian who has their head on straight would agree that the greatest good for America and the greatest good for any nation is that it would be a Christian nation. See what I'm saying? And so and because we're just saying like, "Hey, I believe that the greatest good for a person is to obey the moral law. So therefore, the greatest good for a nation would to also obey the moral law, right?" And I'm just kind of using that as the micro macro. But whenever you kind of begin to include evangelism, discipleship in that process, the end goal of like evangelism and discipleship obviously isn't so that we have another vote to go towards the policies that we like, right? That's a substrate, and that should never be a primary because we shouldn't preach that way we have better votes and that we can have a more comfortable society for us to live in because the goal isn't to get policy through, the goal is for lives to be changed. Policy going through that reflects the lives of the community is a good thing, but it's a byproduct of the primary that lives have to be changed first. Because obviously like it's one thing for somebody like I'll give you an example, man. Like Mormons are fundamentally enemies of Christianity, right? Not personally, but we fundamentally preach different gospels. So that makes us enemies on a religious level, and that's just like basic entry level religious philosophy. That we're not on the same page here. But me, I could probably, if I really wanted to, I could probably go to all the Mormon wards in Mississippi, and I could probably get them to campaign with me on having anti-abortion laws instituted in Mississippi. Right? Don't get me wrong, that would be incredible. But at the same time, like, I'm glad that we can campaign together. I'm glad that we can work together. But they still have a internal issue and an internal fruit of heresy. And Paul lists this out in Romans as heresy is being one of the fruits of the flesh and being one of the byproducts of the flesh. They still have that fruit in their lives, and that removes them from Christianity. And so, even if we can get policy through and we can agree on moral issues, that does not dissolve or deal with the primary issue of a soul that is in need of salvation. And we can't begin to separate those two things. We recognize that one is very simply a byproduct of another, but just because you can get somebody to this place, you can get somebody to vote in agreement with you, doesn't mean that their soul's been saved. And so that's why that still exists as the primary. That's why that still exists as the development of the spiritual formation and the sanctification of the individual. The other one is just a really, really nice benefit. But in the primary, if we're not doing this and if we're not evangelizing and we're just getting a bunch of people to agree with us morally, then we've really, that Christian nation idea just becomes a whitewashed tomb. And all it really is